What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the return of the Complete Sinner's Guide. I am your co-host, Tyler Fowler. With me, as you can see, is a plethora of panels with us tonight. A plethora of guests. We have Joshua Davidson, my beloved co-host, my dear friend, Joshua Sherman, Spencer Owen, our CSG first-time visitor, and again with us, Dr. Jerry Shepard. Gentlemen, it is an honor to be with you all tonight on the return of CSG. I'm so excited. Dude, I was so excited to hear that intro. Man, I just started rocking out.
Yeah.
You know, I love it. I love it. But Josh, brother, how are you doing? Oh, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make an announcement just real quick. So we are doing a Faith Unaltered episode as well. David is taking the reins with Caleb Jackson, Travis Worth, and they are talking about miracles. And so don't tune off of this episode because we're going to be diving in to Leviticus, the Atonement, the Advent, and all things connected to that as well. This is a basically we have done episodes on Faith Unaltered about this very subject. We've had the same guest. We had Will Hess join us for 2 of those episodes, and we had Jeremiah Short, the Black Doctor from TikTok, join us for 1 of those episodes. He was going to join us tonight, but he got called away on from his local church. His pastors had asked him to talk about the virgin birth. And I told him straight up, bro, that is an excusable absence. You are good. So if y'all would please be praying for Jeremiah, but please check out Faith Unaltered's episode after this. Like I said, they had Caleb Jackson. They're talking about miracles. And if you guys don't know, Caleb was actually on, and I know I'm going to butcher this name, so Josh, help me out here, but Capturing Christianity, Cameron's channel, to talk about the very same thing. For those who don't know, Caleb Jackson is writing a book on miracles and modern day miracles and argues for the existence of miracles as a proof for Christian theism. And so David and Caleb are talking about that right now, as well as Travis Worth. And I think Dale Glover is joining them as well. And so y'all want to definitely check out that episode. So Josh, brother, how are you doing? What is new with you, and how does it feel to be back on the Complete Sinner's Guide?
I have to say that the intro is a nostalgic comfort to me. I really like that. Also, it's nice to be back in this seat. I am definitely a fan of being a big part of Faith Unaltered, and that channel is such a blessing to me, and it's been so expansive. But this is definitely home. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited to talk again about this topic. This is a great continuance, and I'm really liking the way that we're diving into this and that we're giving it so much time and attention. I think it's worth talking about. There are a lot of things that you could talk about in Christianity. Not all of them are worth talking about 6 times.
That's right.
I really like this topic. I really like Dr. Shepard's attitude and his graciousness to be able to listen and respond, and his patience when listening, and just everything about this has been so pleasing so far. So I'm really excited to see this happen, and I am very pleased to have Spencer with us this time.
Yes,
it's the first time that I've actually even been on a call with Spencer, so this is really cool. And it's great to see Sherman on here again. Definitely one of my favorite human beings. So we're gonna have a great conversation, and I am really excited. Today was a good day at work, but it was chaotic. We're getting ready for a Christmas party at the rescue mission.
It's for that time of the year.
Apparently today was the day that everything got cleared out and all the decorations needed to go up, and I ended up being the lighting guy. So we're as well as everything else, I had to borrow tools out to people and stuff. It's just a very chaotic day, but a lot happened today. A lot got accomplished today. So I feel good. I feel that kickback of accomplishment and the positive emotion that comes with it. So I'm having a good time. And thank you everybody for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel.
Yes.
And get ready for a good conversation, because this is going to be a good one.
Buckle yourselves in, ladies and gentlemen. This flight is about to take off. Also, like and share. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please hit that big red subscribe button. Click that notification bell, and once you do, you will see all, some, or none pop up. Click all to make sure you get notified every time the Complete Sinner's Guide goes live. And also, please go subscribe to our daughter podcast, Faith Unaltered, youtube.com/at Faith Unaltered. You can find a host of episodes just like this there. And as a matter of fact, I will link to the previous episodes that we've had with Sherman, with Dr. Shepard, not with Spencer, because he is our first time newbie right now. And we will get to his introduction in just a second. But with Jeremiah Short as well, and Will Hess, these guys have collabed and meshed so well, and I think those videos, along with the Dr. Stratton and Chris Date episode, is the epitome of what it means to be Christ-like, even in the midst of disagreement. And so, Sherman, how have you been since the last time you were on Faith Unaltered? But since the last time you've been on CSG, it has been a while, sir.
Oh,
how are you doing?
It has. Yeah, it's been a challenging few months.
Yeah.
Like some stuff with my family and worked my way into a promotion, but that's always fun because you work for it and then you have to work hard at it and you don't know it as well. And so that's always fun too. But yeah, it was neat kind of getting back into the intro, as you guys were saying, and seeing, all the different things and kind of being reminded like, oh, that's right, we did that episode and you guys did that episode and I was on this episode. It's just neat to kind of take that road and to be here on CSG again and to have another conversation about Leviticus, especially, which is, I know for a lot of people is maybe not their favorite part of the Bible, but it ties into so much. And I know reading through what I was able to read through since last time of Dr. Shepard's commentary, he really has that perspective of just the importance of it and the centrality of trying to understand so many things in Scripture with it. So I'm just excited to be here. So
I will say this, and I'll just put it straight up, guys. When I've read through the Bible one time, Leviticus was one of my least favorite topics. Okay, but given the fact that I have got Dr. Shepard's commentary on that, and we'll put a link in the description so if you want that, you can go and purchase that. I think there's a Kindle edition. Oh, that's what I got. I got the Kindle edition. There's also a hardback copy and a paperback copy, correct? No paperback, just hardback and Kindle. Okay. So I will post a link in the description so you can find that if you would like to purchase that. But I will say this, guys, y'all, because of you, Dr. Shepard, because of you, Sherman, and because of Jeremiah and Will, Leviticus is one of my favorite books now. And so I am really looking forward to diving in the subject tonight. And so, Dr. Shepard, you have never been on CSG as well. You've been on Faith Unaltered twice. And so how are you, sir, since the last time we have talked?
Well, like we were talking before we actually went live here, my wife and I have been through 6 weeks of just either having one cold or two colds, and it keeps resurfacing or reinfecting us or whatever. And but so anyway, for 6 weeks we've had congestion and just ill effects from either one or two colds, but we finally seem to have emerged, and so we're doing much better now.
That's great. That is great. So, Josh, I know we're going to introduce Spencer here in just a second. Actually, you know what? We'll do that now, and then I'll ask you the question here in just a second. But Spencer, brother, it is a pleasure to meet you, and it is a pleasure to actually have you on our show. Josh has told me, well, I should say Davidson has told me so much about you, and even Sherman has brought you up in our conversations that we've had. I'm excited that you're here. I am looking forward to your input. Brother, how are you doing? And for those who don't know you, we always try to give our guests that's on the show the first time just the privilege of being able to describe maybe even a testimony, their conversion experience, and what has led you up to the point of where you're at now in your Christian walk. So, brother, I will give you the floor. How are you doing, Spencer? It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Man, I got to cover 40 years in like, a couple minutes.
I'm telling you,
No
bro, you
pressure.
don't look a day over 28. I'm telling you right now.
Yeah.
I need to see your driver's license, sir, because I don't believe you're 40.
I have to like blur out the numbers here.
Private.
Well, I have grown up in the Christian world my whole life, specifically that conservative evangelical world, and started off in like Free Methodist and Nazarene churches, and went to a Christian college out in Indiana. And actually, I know
Indiana.
You guys yeah.
Are you from Indiana?
No, I'm from Illinois.
Okay.
Originally.
Okay.
Yeah. So Midwestern boy, but moved out to Colorado as soon as I possibly could.
Gotcha.
Mostly just because, right. Mostly just because I love being outdoors. I love doing mountain biking. I love doing just being in God's creation. It's one of those things that just feeds me at a soul level. And so this is been out here for 16 years, and this is a dream come true. And I love being out here.
Don't lie. You moved out there for the marijuana. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yes. You moved out here a long time before that became legal.
Yeah, a long time before that. Indeed.
So 16 years. You've been out there now.
Yes.
Right on. Right on.
But I've been a Jesus follower for like I said, by default to a certain extent my whole life, but did the whole altar call and baptism really early on. And I've always really, even from the very beginning, always found intellectual stimulation to be a necessary part of my Christian walk. Like I've really resonated with how in the Shema it says to, or at least in Jesus' version of the Shema, it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that's one of the things that has really resonated with me. Like when I went to college, I minored in philosophy and did some biblical studies work as well. I'm not sure. I know you guys have done some episodes before about open theism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was actually at Huntington College back when John Sanders and Bill Hasker were both there, actually.
Really?
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Took a couple of classes under John Sanders as well. So I'm not where he is, but it was really educational. It was really interesting and very challenging.
So are you familiar with Will Duffy then?
Not
Okay.
really.
So the episode we did on open theism, we had a conversation with Will Duffy. I don't think Chris Fisher was on. Those two kind of like collab together a lot. And so we had Will Duffy on a previous CSG episode to discuss that open theism.
Nice.
So
nice.
Yeah, it was an interesting talk. It was very. I don't hold to open theism by any stretch of the imagination.
I know. Yeah.
but it was an interesting discussion, nonetheless.
Right. So just, I guess, from like a personal Christian standpoint, one of the things that has been really interesting for me to walk through is trying to grapple with that history of conservative evangelicalism and trying to find my own place where I fit, both within and without that, in that sphere. And that's both a personal and a professional thing. So in my day job, I'm a counselor, mental health counselor, who I have my own private practice out here, and I work with my local church. And I specifically specialize in people who have undergone spiritual abuse, spiritual trauma, and I'm working, trying very hard to try to find a way to help people heal from that. And of course, just from my own perspective and my own belief system, I would love to see that become a thing where they can be able to heal from some of the harm done without losing their faith in God along the way. And that's something I try really hard to obviously not push, because, you have to be very delicate and respectful of people who have undergone some traumas. But I want to make sure that at least that door is open. And so as part of that, and that does connect back to Leviticus and Atonement, because I discovered when my daughter was when I discovered my daughter was coming along, I discovered that I really had no idea what how I could articulate, let alone at a young child level, what exactly happened on the cross and what Jesus did for us.
Right.
And I realized exactly what you were saying, Tyler, that, in all of my walking through the Bible moments, I just skipped right over huge chunks of the Old Testament, Leviticus in particular. And I was like, that's got to be rectified. So went back to Leviticus and did about a 5-year, like really deep, very scholarly dive into Milgram and Gain and Sklar and all of the major figures in Leviticus studies, and really tried to, and of course and actually people like Leon Morris as well, who are very traditional in their approach to penal substitutionary atonement. And the thing that I kind of came away with is that I saw something different in the text in the scripture. But what I have really found very important is to build those ecumenical communities rather than just simply saying, so-and-so is wrong, let's, move on. Like I'm still very active and have a couple of different leadership roles in my local, very evangelical church. And I do that because I really want to avoid schism and trying to make it so that even when we disagree, we can still come together and share the scriptures and search it and see what we can find in it. And all in the context of community. And that's the reason why I'm just delighted to be here with you guys in community.
Amen, brother. And that's,
We are delighted to have you.
Yes, we are. And that's the thing we really take pride in both CSG and Faith Unaltered. Like we see so much toxicity whenever it comes to Christians, even, and this is to exclude like atheists and people not of the Christian faith, but whenever Christians come together and they debate things, it gets really nasty sometimes. And we take pride into having Christ-like, loving, truthful conversations. We can agree to disagree, and we can even disagree at the end of the day with each other, but we still maintain that aura of respect and just love for each other. And so, Spencer, we are delighted to have you. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host Joshua Davidson, brother, to tell our audience what are we going to be talking about tonight. I know I titled this Leviticus, the Atonement, and Advent, but if you can give our listeners just a brief summary of what we're going to be discussing tonight, brother, and then we can take it away.
Well, primarily what we're going to try to be doing, if we can, I'm being hopeful that we can stay on task, but what we intend on doing is talking further about Dr. Shepard's commentary on Leviticus, as well as some of the elements that we had brought up in previous episodes, namely things like the scapegoat, the temple, and in general sacrifice, and what atonement is for and what it does. And so it's going to be a probably like a more technical episode than some of the things that we've done on CSG before. But I think that it's, like I said, I think this is a topic that's worth revisiting in order to gain that clarity and have a real long form conversation, because it's not a disagreement that's going to be hashed out in a comment section. That's for sure. And so it's one of those things where what we're going to try to do is play gracefully with a couple of these different ideas and take our time to be thoughtful about our engagement with the ideas that, specifically the ideas that Dr. Shepard has put forth in his commentary. And I know that Joshua Sherman is excited to kind of, let's say, expand some of the conversation that's happened before surrounding these topics. And so I would say, I don't know if you guys have any anything particular that you wanted to start off with.
I guess kind of looking back at especially the last episode that we did, I feel like we can, and I said this is the third time because we talked about it in succession beforehand, but I feel like we kind of shoehorned a little bit of a Leviticus conversation on the end of a conversation that was largely about penal substitutionary atonement and church fathers and these different things. So once we got to that, it was kind of rapid fire. Like, we got to get through some of this stuff. And a lot of that stuff for people that have not taken a dive into Leviticus probably was just a little bit like, I don't even know I don't know what you're disagreeing about. And I don't have the framework to even know what you agree on either. And so I just kind of wanted to take a step back, and maybe we can start with some of the basics of just kind of the understanding of sacred space and what it means to be holy or profane, to be clean, to be unclean, set that framework, and then move forward through some of the different areas of specifics that we talk about when we talk about atonement and sacrifice, when we connect that into what Jesus did, so that people can bring with them a better understanding of the things that people really consistently see a similar way when they're looking at Leviticus and the Old Testament sacrifices, and the places where there are some significant disagreements, and then have that with them as they're going into it, instead of kind of just bringing this thing where I know a lot of us do this because it's convenient and it's what we're used to, but we learned a tradition, and that tradition tells us how to understand the New Testament, and the New Testament tells us how to understand the Old Testament, and we never really get the Old Testament on its own terms to be able to inform the rest of all of that. And sometimes it's like cart before the horse. So that was kind of what I had in my head. If that sounds like a good way to move forward, and then we can hit scapegoat and compare and atonement and these different things that people do have some different views of, and there are multiple layers to, and sometimes the layering is where we get into those discussions too.
Josh, if I can real quick before we jump into it, for our audience sake and for my sake as well, where in Leviticus did you want to begin? That way, if people have their Bibles, they can kind of follow along with us.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I was thinking of even just kind of starting with a couple of visuals just to kind of get some conceptual things up there for the basics, and we could potentially, have Dr. Shepard just kind of give a quick kind of outlay of some of those basics, if that sounds good.
Absolutely. Take it away. And for our listeners, if you would, please, so just one quick announcement, and then I will hand it over. We are listener supported. And so what I mean by that is we rely on our listeners. So if you would take just 2 seconds to like this video, if you like the content, and take 3 seconds to share this video on social media. That way it can get out to as many people as possible. That's my only announcement. Guys, you're good. Take it away.
Spencer, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just going to answer your question and say that the majority of what we're going to be covering is probably going to be in Leviticus chapters 1-7 and Leviticus 16. And I know, there are a couple other passages, maybe 17:11, maybe 10:17 that would come up. But Leviticus 1-7 is probably a good place to start.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, then for the first thing, then I think probably would be in the largest scope, zooming out all the way. Dr. Shepard, can you give us let's say like a 101 intro or a definition for the purpose of sacred space? Like, what is a sacred space, and what is its intended function?
Okay. Before I hit on that particular item, let me just zoom out even further, and talk about why Leviticus is so important. And we'll bring sacred space into that. But what I find, and this may be backtracking a bit, but this is a different broadcast. This is CSG instead of Faith Unaltered, so I don't mind doing it. But I think it's important to recognize just how important Leviticus actually is in the Pentateuch. When Moses is before Pharaoh and is telling him, "Let my people go, let my people go," and does that a whole bunch of times, we tend to focus on that whole idea, let my people go, and give them freedom and liberation, and give them dignity and hope and a future and everything. And that certainly is part of what's involved, but I think it's also important to recognize that what the Exodus is about is a transfer of ownership. The Israelites had for a number of years belonged to Pharaoh, a hard taskmaster. And now God has come to redeem them, to free them, but Freedom means they will now enter the service of a different taskmaster, and that taskmaster is Yahweh, a benevolent taskmaster as opposed to Pharaoh, but nevertheless a very important one. When Moses goes to Pharaoh, several times he says, "Let my people go, let my people go, let my people go." And when he does that, he always tags onto it this line, "so that they may serve me."
Mm-hmm.
And the word serve there, as far as the English translation, serve could be the right translation, but worship is just as much a viable translation as well. So let them go so they may serve me. Let them go so they may worship me. Either one of those really works. And then Pharaoh and Moses have these back and forths about whenever the Israelites leave Egypt, what can they take with them? And initially the idea is we're going to take a 3-day trip into the desert. And in other words, we're going to come back. Now they're not going to. This is kind of part of the ploy and the plundering that's taking place. But interestingly, at one point in their discussion, Moses says to Pharaoh, "We have to take a 3-day journey into the desert to sacrifice to the Lord our God." And Pharaoh says, "Okay, go ahead, but you can't take your animals. You can't take your flocks." And Moses says, "We have to take them because if we don't take them, we won't know which animals to use for sacrifice. We won't know which animals we're supposed to use for the various sacrifices that are going to be enjoined on us." So eventually Pharaoh relents. And to make a long story short, they finally leave with all their flocks and herds. But that statement, "let my people go so they may worship me," and we have to take our flocks with us because we won't know till we get there which animals we're supposed to be using for sacrifices. You put all that together, this is pointing toward Leviticus.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I make a big point about in my commentary is that Leviticus is the purpose of Exodus. Leviticus is what the whole show is about in terms of the Pentateuch. The Israelites are being redeemed from Egypt so they can serve Yahweh and serve him in the right way in the tabernacle with the sacrifices in the sacred space. So you have that element. And then a second element is if you go from, let's say, the last year of the Israelites being in Egypt, where you have the Passover. So we go from Exodus 11 all the way through roughly Numbers 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. That is for a book of the Pentateuch, which goes from creation to get to the Promised Land. For that amount of years that are covered, that section, Exodus 11 to Numbers 12, covers about 1 year. So maybe a year and a half. So in essence, that whole section there is over 40% of the Pentateuch. And yet out of the thousands of years that are covered in the Pentateuch is dedicated to 1 year. So again, that just highlights how important Leviticus is. So when it comes to what Leviticus is all about, I think in many ways it's very fitting that we are covering this episode, this whole topic on this program called The Complete Sinner's Guide, because that's what Leviticus is. It's a complete sinner's guide to being right with God, getting back in his good graces, offering sacrifices at the right times, the right way. And there are two factors involved, especially in the sacrifices. And that is, number one, we want to be clean. We want to be right. We want to be in a position where we can commune with God, that we can come to the tabernacle and not worry about some fire coming out and destroying us because we're not right with And so that's the first thing, the whole idea of establishing communion with God again. But then secondly, it's also about wrath. It's also about being rescued from either the potential or the actual wrath of God for the sins that we can be involved in, and the penalties that we can incur because of our sinful behavior. So pointing now, trying to narrow down to your question with regards to sacred space. On the one hand, I think that it's important to recognize that at least in theory, there shouldn't be any sacred space. All space should be holy. In fact, that's one of the declarations in Isaiah, that the fullness of the earth is his glory. And so that's the way it should be. Nevertheless, I think as a kind of a teaching tool, as a heuristic exercise for the Israelites, I believe that they're utilizing this paradigm of sacred space was a good thing for teaching the necessity of honoring Yahweh's holiness, his holy character, his goodness, his righteousness, his otherness, the fact that he is God and we are not, which is, one of the first two lessons you learn in theology. Number one, there's a God. Number two, you're not him. He's separate from us. And because he is separate, there has to be some kind of distinction there. So sacred space is important, but I think it's also important to recognize that this is a narrowing concept in the Old Testament. We start off in Genesis with the whole earth being sacred space, and kind of like a funnel that narrows down to a limited amount of sacred space. And then Christ comes in the New Testament to restore creation, to restore the whole idea of God's glory filling the earth again. So it's a cone narrowing down, and then when Christ comes, that cone broadens back out again. That's the idea. But at least at this particular time in Leviticus, it is a very narrowed space. It's a teaching opportunity that's taking place there. So, nice. I've got a circle I've got a spinning circle on my screen.
I'm trying to load up.
Okay, I just want to make sure that you can hear me.
I was I was asking in the private chat if.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
So just to wrap this up here a little bit, I think sacred space is important, but again, I think it's a teaching tool, something heuristic for the whole biblical theology of redemption. The tabernacle is holy. It's where God dwells. Those who come and serve in his presence serve in the holiest space there is. Then it broadens out to the courtyard, and then broadens out to the camp. And then beyond the camp, you have pretty much that which is unclean and common and profane and unholy and the whole thing.
I'm going to try to share this again because that's exactly what I was trying to share a picture of.
Sure.
While you're doing that, Sherman, can I ask a clarifying question? So I was thinking of the concept whenever you said sacred space. I was thinking of the concept in the story whenever we see Moses first kind of interacting with God. And God, yes, God tells Moses to remove his sandals, right?
I thought of the same exact thing, bro.
Okay, so let's go back to even the book before Genesis. Is the Garden of Eden, is that kind of a sacred space?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead, Spencer. Go ahead.
Sure. Actually, L. Michael Morales has done an amazing book that tracks that whole concept of sacred space all the way from Genesis all the way into, Leviticus and beyond. But he has a lot. Yeah. Who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? Yep. That's the one that Joshua is holding up.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to see how actually like the Levitical tabernacle is set up as an image of Eden. It's kind of like a reflection of that sacred primordial sacred space, the original intent. And it's really cool to be able to see how God is not trying, that's the wrong word for God, how God is working with us to create, to recreate that ideal through his chosen people of Israel.
And previously on CSG, actually, we're working on getting a part 3 out, but we've done part 1 and 2 of reviewing a presentation done by Jonathan Peugeot of the Symbolic World about Eden as a cosmic structure, the icon that he's made. He calls the image of everything, in which he uses the garden as the very structure that we were just talking about, of the expansion of all creation being sacred space, but it's narrowing to a point. And at the point is, let's say, in the highest place, or the centralized place, is the most holy thing. And what he puts at the top of that holy hill is Christ on a tree, and that tree is the tree of life. And so he has this expansive image that kind of covers a lot of what we've talked about here, and condenses it into a really incredible image. So if anybody who's listening to this is curious about some of those things a little bit further, we actually covered some of that in a previous episode about Eden as a cosmic structure. But yeah, to answer your question, Tyler, Eden is, let's say, the place of places, in the way that the Holy of Holies is the central place, in the way that we said it in the episode before. Eden is the place that makes placehood possible. It's like the location of God's temple, and then that the temple is the tabernacle. That's the mountain of Eden that they can carry around in the wilderness with them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It seems like the Garden of Eden and the Holy of Holies would have a direct corollary with each other. Then, whenever you read on into the Bible. But Dr. Shepard, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that there is a bit of a tension there. I mean, I really like what Morales does, and many people have actually tapped into that. G.K. Beale, for example, has a whole theology written on that. But there is a bit of a tension, because when God creates Earth and creates the universe, the whole thing is good. And so why do you have to have a space that is in some way holier than the rest of it? And so there's a bit of a tension as to why that is like that in the very beginning. But nevertheless, even with that tension, and I think it's important to recognize that for any scene that you have in the Old Testament that kind of prefigures what's going to come after it, there are going to be both continuities and discontinuities. So that's important to keep in mind. But interestingly, what one thing Morales does in that book is make an argument for the animal, the skin that is used from the animal to clothe Adam again. He does, in fact, argue for that being seen as a sacrifice.
Yeah, and I mean, he sees a lot of wrath appeasement everywhere too. So,
and that God is reclothing his priest in the Garden of Eden. So it's a lot of interesting stuff there for sure.
I guess maybe that's a good place to start talking a little bit about that, because one of the things in terms of reclothing the priest, right? One of the things I've noticed in looking at Genesis is that you have this sense of Adam and Eve being priestly. You have them also kind of, in a sense, being the image of God. And, in the parallels with Israel's neighbors, an image was an idol. So you have this very interesting kind of parallel, but also deep contrast there, where you have these living images of the living God versus these dead images of imitators. That's kind of the way that Scripture really kind of brings this contrast. And it's interesting to me because with Israel's neighbors, one of the things they would do is they would actually, they would try to have ceremonies to open the mouth of this idol, and so it can receive sacrifices, and open its eyes and ears and all this, so it could hear prayers and all this. And they would feed it as part of their ceremonies, right? And as part of it, they also had the opening the eyes. And so you have this interesting thing of like when Adam and Eve do partake of the fruit in the middle of an orchard, which is another kind of Mesopotamian thing for it, their eyes are opened. So there's this very interesting thing of like, there's a sense in which they are moving forward in being able to be functioning images of God, and yet also moving forward in a way that's very bad because it's not the way that God told them to do it, right? Because they're grasping for it. And so that reclothing, and this is something I just see differently from Morales. Clothing was another thing that you would do in order to prepare an image in a temple in the pagan world to kind of be what it was. And the same kind of thing with the priests. The priests in Israel in Exodus 28, the way their clothing is described for splendor and glory is literally like tying them in with this idea of splendor and glory in the image of God. And so for me, I look at that and I almost see a sense in which God is saying, you are meant to be my image. That's not going to be derailed. I'm going to move forward in a way by clothing you, but I have to do it in a way that's different because because of your sin, there is now a fundamental difference in how we have to interact, right? And so you're going to bear my image, but it's going to be in a fundamentally different way than it was originally meant for. And then the story of Scripture is almost the sense of bringing us back into that place. And you can see with Israel and with Moses and with the high priest, and then eventually with Christ, this kind of continuing motif through Scripture of this idea of bringing us back to the place where we can properly function in that way. So I guess for me, I don't see that as a sacrifice. I see it as God then clothing them to enable them to be imagers, although albeit in a different way. But it is an interesting point of contention to ask the question about whether or not it's a sacrifice for sure.
Also, there's a bit of a lessening that takes place in the reclothing, because even though he's reclothed as a high priest, he now is exiled from being in the Holy of Holies.
Right.
And he's going to continue his priestly service, but he's not going to have the same privileges and the same access that he had before. So
I have a thought. Speaking of that access, one of the things that I kind of had a question, or at least that I saw as a difference between Morales's view of the sacrifices in Leviticus and what I saw in your commentary, Dr. Shepherd, was the functioning of that hand place, the hand press, the samach of the hand. And I wonder if maybe that might be a good, like, is this a good time to segue into talking a little bit in a little more depth about Dr. Shepherd's commentary, or do we still need to set some background?
Yeah, I think we're pretty much ready to dive in at this point. I feel like his backdrop of Exodus and then the importance of how Leviticus fits in to the entire scope was actually a really great introduction to give a reason why people should understand these things. And I'm hoping that if nothing else, this episode will spur people to, like it has with Tyler and I, to go back and read Leviticus, and not as a drudging, boring, I can't believe it, it's repetition. Like, no, this is a crucial thing, and there's a reason why it's being repeated. There's a reason why it has such emphasis, and there's a reason why things are used, these certain terms and words are used with such frequency, is that they're crucial for the rest of the understanding that you're going to need in order to bring that backdrop into not only the prophets, but also the fulfillment in the New Testament. And so I think it's probably, I think we're at the perfect time to just dive right in. Yeah.
Maybe one other thing that would be helpful is just clarifying on that sacred and profane, pure and impure matrix, so people have an idea of that. That's one of the things that's very common to talk about. Dr. Shepherd talked about in his commentary, and I find it very helpful because it kind of gives you that sense of like, okay, like when we're talking about sacred space, and there's the place kind of out in the world, right, that is no longer sacred space, and a good sense of the reason for that with sacred geography is this idea of of, Yahweh having this land, the land where he's placing his people. And outside of that, you have other nations that are worshiping other gods. And so there's a way in which that's not sacred space because it's being corrupted by the practices of the people and the gods they're serving. And so you have this idea of something being profane is something that is really just, you could just say every day. Right? It's just not meant to be sacred.
Common.
We take that even further sometimes and think, well, profane is like bad. And you could have that correlation there in a sense, if you're thinking, well, I'm in a foreign land that's under another god and it's profane space, but it's not necessarily that kind of thing, right? Oh, hello.
Hi.
Oh, she's so
Hi,
cute.
Kelsey.
And so you have this idea of profane and sacred space, right? So the everyday space, and then the space that is more about being closer to the presence of God, or the fullness of the presence of God, because we have this sense that God is everywhere, but we also have the sense he's also kind of more in certain places than others when he comes to meet with people, when his presence is deeply there. And so you have that kind of maybe one axis, and I was trying to put up an easy drawing of this, but it's not loading, so I'll try to describe it. And then the other one is looking at whether something is pure or impure, right? So are you talking about something that is pure, that's been prepared well for sacred space, that's ready to be, that it's been made ready to be holy, or are you talking about something that is unclean, and uncleanness being something that's kind of a property of encountering death, encountering sin, and corruption, right? So this idea that if God being holy, like, you don't want to be corrupt and coming into the presence of a God who is a consuming fire. It's not safe for you, right? It's not about God being not okay with it. It's about us needing to be safe in doing it. And I think that's one of the things that we actually see. Dr. Shepard kind of noted the kind of the bigger arc of Scripture. You have this kind of narrowing down of the sacred space and the broadening out of it with Christ. And I think one of the things that we see that enables that to happen is Christ's sacrifice, then providing a way to cleanse all of creation of the taint of sin. And we see that with Hebrews 9. We see that with 1 John, I think, 2:2. This idea of this idea that only something can be sacred space. Jesus has dealt with that enough to the point where you can have the Holy Spirit fall on the Gentiles, right? And they're definitely not clean when it comes to the Levitical law, right? So something fundamental had changed at that point, and that's what convinced Peter, like, dude, we can't just be thinking the same way anymore. Something fundamental happened. This happened, and they didn't all die, like, so that kind of sense of, if we want to enter into sacred space, what are the requirements to do that? And a good portion of that is about making sure that if you are unclean for any reason, you touched a dead body, you're a woman that's on your cycle, whatever it is, that's encountering, or that's brought you into an encounter with either a sin that you have that you need to be forgiven for, or uncleanness that's out there that you need to be cleansed of, that needs to be cleansed in order to make you clean. And then when you're clean, then you can enter into sacred space as far as you are able to, with your role within the community in Israel, right? So a priest is going to be able to enter further than a regular everyday Israelite, and the high priest can enter further during the Day of Atonement, and those kinds of things. So I think with that framework, maybe we can kind of move on. Does that make sense?
Sure,
absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, just to visualize things.
Yeah,
there are only really three possibilities in ancient Israel. There is holy, there is profane and clean, and profane and unclean. So there's three possible states. God is holy. Those who approach him are holy, the priests. Then there's profane. And what's important to recognize about Leviticus is that profane does not mean bad. It just means not holy, not dedicated to Yahweh's sole usage. And so profane in that regard, profane simply means common, ordinary, everyday. It doesn't mean bad. But then profane can be coupled with unclean, and then that is bad. Now that's the world of Leviticus and priestly theology. It's important to recognize that later on, when you get to the prophetic books, words have a way of moving from one particularity to another and broadening out. So sometimes the word profane can be used in the prophetic books in particular to refer to bad as well, not just not holy, but that does happen. And so, in particular, when Yahweh complains that the Israelites have profaned His name, well, on the one hand, that means they haven't held Him up as being holy, but then that's also something bad too. So you have that changing dynamic of one word having a narrower, but then also a broader usage as you continue through. But at least for the world of Leviticus, it's either holy or profane and clean, or profane and unclean. And profane and unclean is a bad place to be.
Well, I mean, trying to bring uncleanness into holy space is even worse, I would think. But but that's like one of those things where it's like, it's a category, but it's also a category that doesn't exist for very long because bad things happen.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so glad that you made that distinction between that, like, it's that being unclean is not bad, because like we see in Leviticus how the quote unquote
being
sin
unclean
offering,
is bad.
Well, it is bad in the sense of being able to go into the presence. Yes.
Yeah.
But in the sense of, does it imply moral failure, moral fault? No, not always, at least.
Not always. It can do both. Yeah. It can be a simple ritual impurity, but it can also be a moral impurity as well.
Well, the reason why that seemed important to point out is that in other parts of Leviticus, the quote unquote sin offering, the chatat, is offered for things that are just ordinary everyday things like childbirth, or at least not every day, but potentially normal, things.
You have babies every day?
Yeah, right. So it's really important to stipulate that just because something like a sin offering or a sacrifice is offered does not necessarily mean that a moral wrong had occurred, so to speak.
Yeah. Now I would agree with that. But like I mentioned on the last show that we did, one of the things I want to also argue is that I think you're certainly right in terms of anyone's personal sins, but I think also the idea of childbirth, male and female discharges that are even regular, that all takes place within a world that has been corrupted by sin.
Correct.
So I would still want to argue that even though the woman who gives childbirth has not sinned, nevertheless, the fact that childbirth had danger, death, blood attached to it means that it took place in a world that is contaminated, and therefore a sin offering is necessary to be brought.
Correct.
And that's why some scholars argue for translating sin offering in that case as a purification offering or a purgation offering or something like that. And I see that, and I see the rationale for it. But I and a number of other commentators have argued that it's best to hold on to that sin because then you catch that connection, or hold on to the sin offering designation because you catch that connection. It's not a personal sin, but it's a contextual type thing.
So this is one of the things that gets kind of interesting, even just looking at different views of original sin, because you can have a conversation around that involves that connection to sin and the corruption of sin and the disease of sin and all of these things, that doesn't necessarily involve the idea of inheriting guilt for Adam's sin. And then, of course, the classical Augustinian view is that we do inherit guilt for Adam's sin. So I just thought it was kind of interesting to recognize that whichever kind of the that disagreement you might fall on, what you're talking about would connect really kind of into either idea, right? So if you have this idea of ancestral sin that does not include inheriting damnable guilt for Adam's sin, you still have a sense that creation is not the way it's supposed to be. There is death because there was sin. There's corruption, and corruption leads to death, and that is all kind of tied together, and that's part of what needs to be dealt with. So it's interesting to me to connect to that and say, when I first heard what you were saying last time, I was like, I don't know if I like that, but recognizing, I think the place where I particularly would just see it a little bit differently here, is that I do tend to hold more to the idea of ancestral sin, rather than seeing that we also inherit damnable guilt for Adam's sin. And maybe that's actually the difference in my head of how I'm then seeing what you're saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that probably, is more of a New Testament discussion in terms of trying to get things ironed out.
Sure.
But nevertheless, even in the New Testament, as you alluded to, I think the whole idea is that God, on account of the fall, has subjected creation to frustration. And so even the good things that we do have a taint to them. Or, I mean, I don't want to say a taint of sin, but a taint of the effects of sin. And,
come into contact with death.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I wanted to see if maybe I could bring up that question of the laying out the pressing the hands on the sacrifice.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, my thing has gone to sleep now because it's been sitting here. But in Morales's book, Who Shall Ascend to the Mountain of the Lord, he talks about how with that hand press gesture, how there have been multiple different ideas about what it means, whether it means ownership, which I believe is Milgram's position, or whether it means like some kind of sin transfer. And you address that to a certain extent in your commentary. And then, but one of the things that he points out that I think is really a good point is that when the idea of looking at it as a sin transfer, like saying, okay, now my sins are now passing to this animal and it dies instead of me. One of the difficulties with that is that then the animal goes into sacred space. So to say that this animal is now absorbing the sin in some way is to say that it becomes impure. It takes on impurity. And then to have it then go into sacred space doesn't make a whole lot of sense with that. And so I actually kind of noticed a little bit of a tension in your commentary, where I know you had said at one point specifically, while the hand leaning right does not technically transfer the offerer's sins as such onto the sacrificed animal, it does in some respect transfer the offerer's own person as one who is a sinner.
Yes.
But then, like later on, you, in referencing Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:21, you say that like Paul is describing Christ as having sin imputed or transferred to him, even as happens with the sacrificial animal and the sin offering. So to me, there's a little bit of a tension that I'm trying to gain a better understanding of where you're coming from when you say, well, basically, what do you think is occurring with that? And how would you address Morales's challenge about how can it be sin transfer, since then impurity goes into sacred space?
Boy, this is a labyrinth of
yes, it is. You're 100% right.
But ultimately, amidst the views that are out there, I kind of adopted Roy Gaines' view on this.
Yeah.
And you said you alluded to him earlier.
Yeah.
And
which is still part of that pollution and purge, model.
Right.
Like, yeah.
And so just to kind of back up here, I guess the traditional understanding has been that the blood of the sacrificial animal after the sacrifice is sprinkled or splattered or daubed or smeared,
depending on what it is.
Furniture, the burnt altar burnt offering, or if it's the priest's sin or the community sin, even inside the tabernacle itself. Gain's alteration on that is to argue that what's really happening there is that the blood of the sacrificial animal is not being put on the burnt offering or the tabernacle furniture in order to purify it, but in order to for God Himself symbolically to bear the sin of the sinner, and that when you come to the Day of Atonement, the blood that's taken in then reverses that process. So it's two different actions. They're both symbolic, but one symbolizes sin being applied to the burnt offering and the tabernacle furniture. The other one symbolizes the sin being removed. And so even though I think there are some problems with Gain's understanding there, I still lean toward that.
Yeah.
So what he does then is take that as being symbolic of the fact that, in essence, everything he argues is symbolic. The priest bears the sin of the people. The tabernacle furniture bears the sin of the people. And that all is then symbolic of Yahweh Himself bearing the sin of His people.
Got it.
So that's the way I understand that.
Okay. That helps a little bit. Because it sounds like with Gain's thesis that you are seeing a kind of sin transfer in that hand press.
Yeah.
Am I hearing you right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's also the idea that it's the whole person that's being transferred, not just I'm laying my sins on you, but this animal's taking my place as a whole person.
As a like we talked about in the last episode, like as a substitute. Is that fair to say? Because
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say because it seems like, transferring this into a New Testament context, and Spencer, I'm curious as to your interpretation of 1 Peter 2:24, right? Because the text specifically says He Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, right? So go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really glad. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah. Because Isaiah 53 talks about He bore the iniquities of the people. So like that whole concept of bearing sin is ubiquitous in terms of both the New Testament and the Old Testament. However, I do think it's really interesting, though, that textually speaking, now I'm going only off of explicit references. This is not necessarily like you can read a lot into like it's implied, it's assumed, those kind of, it's symbolic. I'm not denigrating that. I'm just saying only in explicit reference. There are only two figures that are said, actually 2/3, that are said to bear sin. The Nasa of Owen. Bear the iniquity. The priest in his priestly role, priestly function, and the goat for Azazel in Leviticus 16. Now, of course, you could also look at like a passage like Exodus 34 when 6 and 7, when God says, I am Yahweh, and He says forgiving iniquity, which the Hebrew words there are also Nasa Avon. So, I mean, you could also add a third one there and say God Himself is the one bearing iniquity. But I do find it that to me that presents at least a tension and a challenge to the traditional PSA understanding of what's going on in the Levitical sacrifices. When you look at the fact that textually speaking, it's not the sin bearer that is killed. So when Peter is saying, or when the author of that particular epistle is saying that Jesus Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, I'm inclined to look at that and say that could either be a priestly function or perhaps an elimination rite is what Milgram would call it, rather than a sacrificial function as the animal that dies, because that's not what we see in Leviticus. Again, explicitly.
Right.
Just a real quick response to that, by the way, Spencer. And by the way, I should say this. Spencer and I are old discussion buddies from another
I was going to say,
it's nice to actually meet you in person.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
But
actually, Dr. Shepard was the first one who schooled me on the meaning of kapare, and I'm enormously thankful for that. So
you're certainly welcome. But but I'll just make one note here about going from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Like I said earlier, there are going to be discontinuities and there are going to be continuities. Additionally, there are going to be conflations. And so that's what I think may be happening in the New Testament, with the idea that the victim is said to be a sin bearer as well. So I think that's possible anyway.
Can I ask you also a question on something? So Jeremiah and I was actually talking about this off air, just actually previously today. And given the fact that what we see in the Old Testament, granted, they are individual. And what I mean by that is there are different sacrifices, for sin. There are different functions, such as the high priest. But given the fact that Jesus, in his sacrifice as our high priest, because we got to think in the Old Testament, not to my knowledge, but the priest was never sacrificed. Fair enough?
Right.
So given that Jesus actually typifies the sin offering, the guilt offerings, all of these things kind of in one, not only that, but as the priest as well, wouldn't it be relevant to actually see him as the antitype or as the fulfillment of those types and shadows that we get in the Old Testament law that breaks things down kind of individually in that sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
The way that I often will try to talk about this is in pointing out the difficulties of being too linear with that thinking, and then trying to see how to maybe go about it. So if you try to be super linear with it and you think, okay, Jesus fulfills each one of the individual's Old Testament sacrifices, so I can look at the Old Testament sacrifice, look at exactly what happens and apply it to Jesus in exactly that way, you're going to run into some really crazy stuff, right? Like, for instance, they never drank the blood of the sacrifices, and yet Jesus is like, here's the cup of the new covenant in my blood, right?
And the Jews freaked out whenever he said that.
And they should, because it's a major shift, right? So you have things like that where if you try to say, here's the pattern and Jesus fits into this pattern exactly, you're going to run into some weird stuff. And there's also so many patterns, you can't really do that in a linear way anyways. I think what we see maybe more something like all of those things pointing to Christ as the actual archetype of those things, as the one who is the true version of what all of those were put in place to accomplish, and even beyond, right? Because they weren't able to purify the conscience in the way that Christ's sacrifice is. And so if we think of that as him being the fulfillment of all those things, of them pointing to him because he is the archetype, he's the perfect one, and he's beyond even just fulfilling them, but bringing to a fullness what they were even meant for, and couldn't necessarily accomplish to the same level, then I think we can start to put all them together and say, yes, Christ was the fulfillment of all of these things. We just have to be a little careful about how the picture we have in our head about what that means about his relation to each individual.
No, that makes sense.
So it would be something more like he's not merely the completion of those things, he's the source of their need for completion. He's the thing that not only they were pointing at, but he's the thing they were meant to be. Perhaps it's hard to use other language besides what you just said, like the archetypal. He's the ground floor of sacrifice. He's not.
There's an argument to be made for seeing Abraham and Isaac and the ram as a substitution of animal sacrifices for the sacrifice of the child of the promise, which is Isaac, and also Christ. And saying that this is essentially almost like putting in something that's meant to be, this is going to fill the time for the people of Israel until the true sacrifice that can, take care of these things is made in Christ. So it gets really interesting when you start to look at those connections.
Because like you were saying, Josh, even though you can't take the sacrifices of the Old Testament as a one-for-one, right, with Jesus, because like the writer of Hebrews, Josh's favorite book, right, the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. So Jesus' sacrifice did something that was further or higher, so to say, than what they even combined really did, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
And that's a principle actually that a lot of people, I think, should probably understand a little bit more clearly, is that symbolism itself is rarely, if ever, in any case, a one-for-one
Right.
representation from one thing to another. Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
take, for instance, sheep and goats in the New Testament is a reference to followers and stubborn non-followers, right? And
Mules.
yet in the Old Testament, goats are actually something that's integral to what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And it's not
Goats were
necessarily like a
sacrificed.
goat is
Mhm.
simply a symbol of evil. It's something that is contextual. Symbolism is contextual. It's not, it's like a
Yes.
language, right? It's not something that simply is like a useful fiction that works only in one way.
Right.
It's
Mhm.
something that is fully contextual. And so, yeah, I think that's an
Yeah.
important distinction to make, is
Mhm.
that Christ is something that's being symbolized all over the Old Testament. But to say that any one thing is the symbol of Christ, I think would be
Or can
completely
define or
condensing
contain
things.
him or anything else like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just
Right,
missing
right,
the point.
exactly.
Right. Just for example, you've got individuals like Jacob, for instance, Israel, that
Mhm.
typified Christ. You have sacrifices that typified Christ. You have Isaac that typifies Christ in certain contexts, right? And so
Adam, Moses,
And
Noah,
Moses,
yes,
David, yeah.
and the
exactly.
list goes on and
Joshua.
on and on.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
One very practical upshot of this, by the way,
Yeah.
is in Romans 3, where you have the discussion about God presenting Christ. And traditionally, the translation has been something like a sacrifice of atonement.
Mm.
And so the Greek word there is hilasterion.
Ah, yes.
And what for a long time, that word has been translated as atonement. That is the concept or the act of atonement. Others have come along and said, no, hilasterion refers to the atonement cover that the blood is sprinkled on.
The mercy seat.
And so that, then in their mind it becomes an argument against PSA, because now Christ is the atonement cover. But the very same passage, just 2 words later, says it's through faith in his blood. So it's not just that Christ is the atonement cover. I mean, if you want to reduce it, if you want to go that way and say the atonement cover, that's fine. But whose blood is being splattered on the atonement cover? It's Christ.
Mhm.
And who's the one doing the splattering? It's Christ as the priest. And so he is priest, he is victim, he is the temple itself, the tabernacle itself. So that's where all this conflation comes into place. And so Joshua has made a very good point here. You can't do a one-for-one. It's there's a fluid freedom when you come to the New Testament as to how you combine these things.
Right. Good stuff, y'all. Good
So
stuff.
speaking of goats,
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about the scapegoat thing, because that ties directly into Spencer's question about pure and impure, and bringing impure sacrifice into the sacred space. And then let's say the need to purge the sacred space, or to purge the people,
right,
in order to be associated with or in relation to the one who resides in the sacred space.
Right. Well, and that's one of the reasons why I struggle with any kind of like a sin transfer thesis in that hand press, because when you see in the Leviticus 16 with the Azazel goat ritual, even the guy who handles the Azazel goat is considered unclean and has to go wash, because the Azazel goat has a double hand press compared to a single hand press, and it has sins confessed over it. It's like explicitly like there's a transfer there, and because of the double hand press, because of the sins being confessed. And then from that point on, I mean, Morales actually says this is because once the transfer of sin has taken place with the scapegoat is no longer worthy to be brought into the divine presence, and then it gets sent out. And so there's, but we don't see that with the regular hand press and the sacrifices. And so I have some difficulty with seeing the hand press, meaning, okay, now my identity as a sinner is transferred onto this animal. because we don't see any of this like impurity ritual occurring with the priest after that. And then, of course, I have further questions about, like, to what extent does that apply to everything else besides the death, like the flaying of the animal and the separation of the hide and the offering of the choice portions up by fire? Like, in what way is that an identification process? I mean, it kind of works for the death. It doesn't quite work as neatly for those things. And so I'm curious, Dr. Shepherd, how would you take a look at that hand press based off this kind of sin transfer idea that you've been talking about, and how would that play in with the differences between what we see in the Azazel goat and what we see in the Chatat, for example?
Mm-hmm. That's a, for sure, that's a tough one to fill out with any measure of super confidence. Because, again, one of the things that is so frustrating with Leviticus is that it doesn't spell out what the reasons are. I mean, sometimes you get some very good hints.
It's like either you know what this means and I don't need to tell you, or I'm just not going to tell you.
It seems more concerned with the mechanics as opposed to the theory behind the mechanics. But I'm not sure where I was going with that. But I think first of all, what's important to recognize is that the goat for Azazel is not a sacrifice. It's not.
That's explicit in Leviticus 17.
It is sent into the wilderness, and in my opinion, it's sent to the wilderness to take the sins back to the devil that they came from, or whatever Azazel is, that demon. And as I mentioned on another show, I think that corresponds quite well to what happens in the narrative of Jesus' baptism, followed by the temptation. But but
and I would also argue on the cross, but hey, that's beside the point.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I see that with the whole idea of the harrowing of Hades too. That sense of Christ descending to Hades, and this picture of him bringing the whole bag of sin with him and being like, "This belongs to you. You thought it could hold everybody captive. Actually, it's worthless. So here's your counterfeit money." Is kind of the picture in my head.
Is that like the Santa Claus reference, Josh?
Yeah.
But I'm so sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Shepherd.
I guess I only have a couple of points to make. First of all, I think that the hand leaning ceremony with the scapegoat, or what's called the scapegoat. I wish I could get away from that language. And forever and ever bury anything Rene Girard's ever written. But
I love a lot of what he wrote, but that part is definitely one of the weaknesses for me, because he just kind of smeared.
He just doesn't understand the so-called scapegoat ritual.
Yes.
But, So the first thing I'd say is I don't think that the what happens with the scapegoat ritual is the same thing as happening in the regular handling that takes place with the other sacrifices. It's different. And therefore, as opposed to the other sacrifices where there's a hand leaning, I don't think there's a transfer of person. There's not an identity of there's not an identity of being formed between the so-called scapegoat.
Because the sins of the entire,
it's just sins.
The sins of the whole community are done.
And of course, on that same day, the Day of Atonement, there would have already been a hand-leaning exercise with regards to the sin offering and the guilt offering, the animals that were actually sacrificed. So that's a couple of things that I would say there. I had actually a third thing, but it flew in and flew right back out, which is typical of me these days.
I do.
I'm going to go ahead and take credit, take the blame for that, because I cut you off and interrupted you. So
I can't remember what there was a third point. Oh yeah, I think I've already did it when I mentioned Rene Girard. So I think it is it's a different symbolism there
Okay.
that's being used.
Well-
And so now what complicates things is that earlier in the narrative, it does talk about both goats, the one that sacrificed and the goat for Azazel. It seems to bring them together under the heading of sin offering. But I think that's probably not, we're probably not supposed to take that from it.
Okay.
I think it's two goats that come together. One will be chosen as a sin offering, one will not. I think that's really what's being talked about there. However, both goats have a role to play in the atonement process.
Yes.
And
both are mentioned with that.
I guess my next point, and that is we can't locate atonement in any one particular action.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't. In fact, for those of us who love the book of Hebrews, who else does? Oh,
Josh Davidson
Josh,
does,
okay.
and everybody here.
Yeah.
So any self-respecting Old Testament scholar, it should be their favorite New Testament book. As David Moffat has done a great service. I think,
oh my gosh, David Moffat is so. Oh my gosh, this stuff is so good.
Yeah. So as important as, of course, the death of Christ is, Hebrews really emphasizes that there is a completing action to atonement, and that's the presentation of the blood in the heavenly places.
I'm curious when you think that happened in kind of history, if you will, because I've seen different people kind of try to place that at the cross somehow, or Holy Saturday. The usual one that I see is that that's something that happens after the ascension. Is that? Yeah,
that's where I put it.
Okay. Very interesting.
Okay. Well, I'm actually really glad that you brought in Moffat, because there's a quote that I ran across in his work that I thought was really important to understanding what's going on in Leviticus. And he says, it is not the slaughter of the animal that brings the benefit of the sacrifice, purification, and forgiveness, but when, where, and by whom the blood is sprinkled, poured out, and applied. And to me, that connects directly back to what we see in Leviticus 17:11, where, I mean, you were saying earlier, man, like Leviticus just doesn't explain the meaning behind things. It's not explicit about this. Well, one of the places it is there. And it says, like, I've given you the blood to make atonement. And that works because the life is in the blood. And it even repeats it a couple of verses later. And so I'm wondering, especially when we look at like this kind of identification, saying like, the animal dies in my place, so to speak, it feels like it kind of misses a really important piece, that blood is explicitly stated as being about life and not death. And I know there's nuances, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But then also, like, kind of like what Moffat was saying, is that it's not the slaughter and the death of the animal itself that is the salient piece, the efficacious piece of the sacrifice. It's the blood manipulation that really affects the atonement.
Well, and you could even throw in the burnt offering itself when you're talking about the Levitical sacrifices and sacrifice in the Old Testament, because that is also connected into atonement. And that's that idea of something being wholly offered to God. I love the idea of calling that an ascension offering because of the smoke ascending. And I don't know, but I do kind of wonder and look at that, and the fact that you have ascension also talking about Christ ascending to the Father, and him ascending in person as a pleasing aroma, and the way that kind of connects into this idea of the whole life of Christ being dedicated to the service of God, and to being obedient in the way that the first Adam was not. And so, anyway,
that's how that Greek word yodia, that pleasing aroma, gets used all the time in the New Testament, whether it's about the apostles and their life of service, not their death. Of course, they do eventually die, but that's not what's being That's not what's explicitly in view in the New Testament text, like Romans 12:1, 2 Corinthians 2:15. And then, of course, it, in Ephesians 5:2, Paul does actually say like that Christ was that pleasing aroma as well. And so, of course, the question then becomes like, is it talk about the death of Christ that creates that pleasing aroma, or is it more like the life of Christ and, all of his saints who follow in his footsteps, is that pleasing aroma? And that's where I think that distinction that Leviticus 17:11 makes between the blood as the life is a really important one to at least engage with, even if it's not completely dispositive one way or the other. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. Shepherd.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, you mentioned a whole bunch of things there, so I'm going to try to take.
I really did. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. That's right. Going back to David Moffat, I wonder whether when he makes that statement, he's trying to introduce a dichotomy, or if, as Marva Dawn used to say, he overspoke to make a point. And so I think that probably he didn't mean to say that the death of Christ is not atoning, but that the atonement is not completed until the presentation of the blood in the heavenly place.
Right.
So, and if that's and if I'm right in that, and I think I am, that just simply goes on to show that atonement is a process with lots of facets to it. So I guess that's the first thing I would say there.
Yeah.
With regards to the Leviticus 17:11 thing, I'm not convinced that that the idea is that in some way the blood removed from the animal has life in it. I don't think that's what the passage is trying to say. I think it's simply a way of referring to the fact that a life has been offered in order to give you this means whereby you can have your lives atoned for. So I don't think there's anything. I don't think we're supposed to come away from that passage thinking that the life that the blood is now having been shed is some kind of living, I guess, magical fluid that has properties in it that make it well, I'm not sure the word to use there.
Yeah, atoning.
Well, not I was looking for atoning, but that it has some kind of chemical property that now communicates life. I don't think that's the idea.
Right. Okay. All right.
Can I actually say something? Can I say something real quick? For what you just said, you were talking about the blood as a substance, and then you immediately went to like its material substance, right?
It's like material composition.
Right, exactly. I think if we're talking about this, and especially since what we're using is largely centered around symbolic use of these these images and these things, that, let's say, symbolically speaking, which I think is a more substantial reality than just simply the material that something's made of. The blood, even though it doesn't, let's say, have physical compounds that amount to anything like magic or a transformation of something, could we say that instead it actually has a meaning or a symbolism that corresponds to that cleansing in some real sense? And if I
think that's okay. Yeah, I think that's
if,
all right.
If it does, then isn't that more important than its physical composition?
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose so. I think that's fair.
Okay,
well,
so then if we say that if we say that the blood does in fact do something in that sense, it's not operative like a scientific fact, but it's operative as a truth, right? Like there's something that does occur because of this reference to blood as life, and the way that it's used actually, let's say in the New Testament, the way we understand the blood of Christ being the thing that by taking it in, we receive more Christ life or the grace that's present in the Eucharist. I'm seeing this kind of as an analogous thing together. And I feel like if we reduce it to its material composition and then say, well, because of that, it's not doing anything. I think we're kind of like separating it in a way that's, perhaps less useful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. But maybe Spencer, maybe you want to clarify what you were trying to say, or
yeah, sure. I actually would kind of go in a similar vein in that, like what I was hearing in Leviticus 17 is that God says the reason why that blood is what it is because I have given it to you to make atonement for, or to make kippur, for your nefesh. And I kind of hear echoes in like the Noahic covenant, for example, when after the flood and the ascension offering there, then God stipulates, I don't want you to eat any nefesh that has the blood in it, because and I don't think it's I honestly can't remember off the top of my head. I don't think it's explicitly indicated at that time in Genesis 8 or 9 that that it's because of the atonement factor. But I'm drawing a link between the two and saying that like almost like the blood is a special holy substance that God has kind of categorized in symbolically in this holy, most holy category. And we actually see that in Leviticus where like, the basin that catches the blood has to be either washed or broken because it has come into contact with that most holy substance. And if it gets splashed on the clothes of the priest, then they have to, do some, efficacious ritual to deal with that. And so again, I suppose
and you have the same kind of thing even with the meat of the sin offering, right? I believe the priests have to eat that in the holy place, and they have to do that because it's considered most holy. And that's
a couple of different offerings, not just a sin offering.
Yeah, but that's part of the one of the challenges I have with Gaines' view as well is that if you're talking about even the meat of those offerings being considered most holy, I don't see how that works with his view. So, yeah, it's just kind of interesting there.
Yeah. So yeah, I suppose that's why I'm really insistent on the blood is the life of the animal, not which includes death. I'm not trying to like marginalize death as if that doesn't matter. It definitely matters, but sometimes when I hear presentations of PSA and I see that specifically talked about in connection with Leviticus, there's like, well, look, see the animal dies in your place, and that's the emphasis. And it's like, really, actually, what I think is more going on there is that God is giving the Israelites a very specialized, most holy substance to be able to purge, expiate, cleanse, purify their sin, or at least the contamination of sin. And he's designated that as like a special thing. And specifically because the life of the animal is in the blood.
So I'm curious. Oh, go ahead. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting to me in talking about that moment of hand pressing, the way that that we seek a variety of views of that, right? I tend to, I think I agree with Spencer. I don't see the sin transfer thing there because of the fact the sacrifice is then most holy. And I don't see how that would work with it having sin kind of transferred to it in that instance. But what we do see in Morales talks about this, and Dr. Shepard, you talked about is that idea of that kind of totality of person transfer or identification that seems to be more than just I'm the owner of this animal, right? And what is that exactly? If we look at that purely in terms of a substitutionary kind of thing, I got kind of turned around a little bit in Morales when he then would talk about the fact that the blood of the animal is then taken into the Holy of Holies, and that's a way for the person to then participate with the animal and entering into that space kind of vicariously. And I'm looking at that going like, I feel like you're talking about substitution and participation at the same time, and those are mutually exclusive kind of by definition. So I don't know what to do with it. the place where I think it makes sense to me is when you talk about the animal being offered up as a wholly devoted gift to God, as a pledge of your devotion to God. And you could look at this almost as like a vow of saying, like, this is how seriously I take this relationship, and I'm offering this up to you. And that kind of a more that deep identification, but also participation, because it's not just saying, this is now in my place, but this is demonstrating my level of commitment to turning away from the sin I committed that got me here, to following the law, to worshiping only Yahweh and no one else, and that sense of that whole commitment of the person being kind of in a sense kind of caught up with the animal. That view of that has captured me, and it'll become pretty clear. There was some of my closing comments, partly why, because I see connections into the New Testament as well. So I guess I would be interested to see what how you see that, Dr. Shepherd. If anybody else has any thoughts or comments on that kind of a view of the sacrifice as a sense of commitment and a welcoming gift to God.
Okay. Tyler
I'll
said
let
he has.
someone go.
Tyler said that he has a question, actually.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I want to wait until if anybody wanted to comment on what Josh you just said. But if not, then I will. I'll ask my question. Then I got to bounce. My lovely wife just got home, and she got home early, and she wants to spend a little time with me. But guys, go ahead if you want to answer Sherman's questions, or if you got comments on it. I can wait.
I guess at the moment, I really don't have a good answer for your question.
Okay.
Certainly, I think the offerings, some more than others, have a factor to them of devotion. I think that's true with the burnt offering, the grain offering, perhaps the fellowship offering. The sin and guilt offerings, I think they're much more focused. Their orientation is much more in terms of placating a God who is angry. I don't think it's really so much about a wholehearted devotion there. And even the burnt offering, of course, has an atonement factor as well. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, just the fact that you're bringing an offering indicates that you're already offering something to God. But whether it's supposed to represent wholehearted devotion, I'm not quite sure. And I'm not sure if that wholehearted devotion is connected to the blood as such. I'm not sure that's so much the function of the sacrifices, as opposed to the whole animal being that a representative of that devotion. Which again, of course, is what comes into play with the burnt offering, because that the whole animal is goes up in smoke.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a good answer for you on that one. I haven't thought it through like with regards to that one yet or not.
Well, Doctor.
I was just going to say, I think part of the reason that I go there, even when I'm thinking about the sin offerings and the guilt offerings, is that you definitely have a sense that while the offerings are required and there are very specific rules about what to bring and what to do, the offering in and of itself doesn't do anything in a mechanical sense that somehow binds God to responding in a certain way. Right.
Yeah.
So you don't have a sense of the offering being magical. You don't have a sense of the same procedure always getting the same result. So, you could do a sin offering for someone that has committed one of the offenses that's thinks something that's forbidden, and they would bring the sin offering, and the result is atonement and forgiveness. They could also bring a sin offering when you're talking about purification for after childbirth, and the result is atonement and purity. Right. And so there isn't so much a sense of that linear kind of mechanistic view of things. But what you really do see in the prophets, especially, is the sense that, it really is the person coming with the right heart coming with a pure conscience, coming with the right relationship between themselves and God, and between themselves and sin, which is facing God and away from sin, right? That really, deeply is tied into that, and we see that when we get into things like Saint Irenaeus, who says sacrifices do not sanctify a man, for God stands in no need of sacrifice, but it is the conscience of the offerer that sanctifies this sacrifice when it is pure, and this moves God to accept the offering as from a friend. And so that's where I see some connection there, even when we're talking about those offerings, because they wouldn't do anything if the person's isn't coming with the right heart. Does that make sense?
Yeah. By the way, let me get back to one part of the question that both you and Spencer have raised.
Yeah.
And that is how, if there's been some kind of transfer of the person or the sin to the animal, how can the blood then be used as a purifier? And again, Roy Gain is one who has sort of been the chief advocate for the view that the blood is in fact transferring sin to the tabernacle furniture and etc. So it actually serves initially as a contaminant as opposed to a detergent. And whether he is right or wrong with that, I think we still have two things to consider there. And one of those is that the priest bears sin. Now he's holy. And so if he bears sin, does that now make him unholy? So that's a question to ask there. And then going outside the circles of Leviticus, you have that passage in Numbers 35 where it talks about the shed blood of the one who has committed a crime there. His shed blood is atoning. Now, here is a sinner, and of course, the whole problem is his own fault. I mean, he sinned, he killed someone. Nevertheless, it says there that the atonement can be made for the land only in that case by the shedding of the blood of the one who murdered. So their impure blood is being used to make an atonement, though in that case it's the impure blood of the person who actually sinned. So there's all kinds of little nicks and scratches in any one of these theories that we come up with. But anyway, nevertheless, good questions, good points.
Dr.
Tyler?
Shepard, yeah, I wanted to go ahead and jump in here because I've got to run. So on and Dr. Shepard, I want your comments as well as Josh and Spencer, because I'm really curious about this. And so I was talking to Jeremiah, and he wanted me to kind of bring out the legal aspects of sin as well as the legal aspects of the remedy for sin. And so the reason I say that is because, and I'm going to jump New Testament here. I know y'all are blowing me away with your knowledge of Leviticus. Like it really makes me, and I really want our viewers and our listeners to really get a new love for Leviticus as well as the Torah. Just because of the conversation that we're having here, there is so much to really dive into here, and y'all are just blowing me away. But since I know the New Testament a little bit better than I know the Old Testament, I wanted to get y'all's opinions on this, and with the legal aspect of sin and the atonement and the remedy for sin. And so I'm just curious. So if we define sin, so two questions really, Dr. Shepard. If we define sin, because we've talked a lot about sin, a lot about the remedy, but and forgive me if I missed it. I was out a little bit. My wife had came in, and I ran and saw my little baby girl for a second. So if y'all discuss this at that part, forgive me for bringing this back up, but I think it would do good for our listeners, even if we have touched on this already, to kind of retouch on it, because there is an aspect I really believe, guys, I truly say this from the bottom of my heart, that there is, like I said in the ending, in my outro of the last video, like I really believe there is a legal aspect to sin. Therefore, there has to be a legal aspect to the remedy for sin. And so 2 questions. My first question is, Dr. Shepard, in 1 John 3:4, it says this. I'm reading from the Greek text here. So all doing sin also does lawlessness, and sin, he hamartia, esten he anomia, right? Sin is lawlessness. And so if we've read Dan Wallace's book, he defines there's 2, whenever you see this subject and predicate nominative construction here, there's really 2 options one can take. One can see this as a subset proposition, which all that means for listeners that don't know Greek is this: a predicate nominative describes the class to which the subject belongs. So it's not a direct one for one, but more so it is a class, one particular instance of a class. So for example, Josh is a human being, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every human being is Josh, right? And then you have what's called a convertible proposition. Now, a convertible proposition, so for example, think of a mathematical formula, right? A equals B, B equals A. Josh is a human being, and a human being is Josh, right? Those 2 things make perfect sense. But again, so we see in 1 John 3:4, he hamartia esten he anomia, right? Dr. Shepard, do you believe that whenever John defines sin here as lawlessness, do you think this is more of a convertible proposition, i.e., the 2 are a one for one, or do you think that sin is more, or I'm sorry, lawlessness is more of a subset proposition of sin here? Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Kind of.
Okay.
I don't know if it makes enough sense for me to be able to answer the question.
I guess what I'm asking is sin a one for one to lawlessness, or is sin a class of lawlessness?
Boy, that's a tough one. It's going to depend on how you, first of all, define sin and lawlessness.
Okay.
And I'm not so sure about Wallace's categories of doing that, but
okay.
I would tend to think that I would tend to make sin the broader category, actually.
Okay.
And
So
fit lawlessness into sin.
Okay.
In terms of lawlessness referring to distinct commands, imperatives, or prohibitions that God has specified, whereas sin is the larger category. Though, of course, Paul comes along and says, well, how do you know you've sinned? Well,
right.
By the law. So
also sin is anything not done from faith, right?
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, that I think, in essence, I affirm your basic idea here that there is a forensic element to what's going on. And Leviticus is, these are laws, these are statutes,
right?
And they are about laws and statutes that are being broken. So there is a forensic element to the sin itself, and there is a forensic element to God's remedy for sin.
Great.
And so
that answers both of my questions.
I think that classic passage here would be in Colossians, where Christ's death is a way of canceling our indebtedness to the law and the power that it has over us because of our violations.
Right. Because what I'm thinking is, and Sherman, I promise I'll let you get in just as soon as this, and as soon as I say this, I got to bounce, guys. So this was an awesome conversation. I love you all so much, and I want to go back and listen to it again. Like I said, I missed parts of it. but just going back to the very first instance of sin, right? God said to Adam in the garden that the day that you eat of this tree, you shall surely die, right? And it just seems to me, and like I tried to enunciate in my last, or in our last video, right, at the very end of the outro, that even if we take, and I just want to reiterate this again for everyone, our listeners, our panel, for everyone, if we hold to one view of the atonement, I think we're doing the atonement a very, I don't think we're doing all the justice we can to the atonement if we only hold to one aspect of the atonement, right? I think the atonement is something that involves Christus Victor. I am a wholehearted Christus Victor candidate, right? Like, I love Christus Victor. I also love penal substitutionary atonement. I also love the moral influence theory. I think they all really go hand in hand with the atonement. It all depends on what sense you are talking about. But to back up to what I was saying about Adam, and then guys, I've got to run. I love you all. But whenever we read in Genesis, the day you eat of this tree, you shall blank, blank, blank. Whatever that is, it seems like there is a punishment or a consequence even for doing what God either said not to do or doing something just against the God's will, right for us. God said, you shall eat of every tree except for this one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what did Adam do? He goes and eats of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then there are consequences for that. I say all this to say this one thing, and then really to reiterate what I said in the last video. Guys, it just seems to me that, and I could be wrong, I could stand corrected, but if there is an aspect, just one little aspect of the forensic view of the atonement, right? And we get this from passages like 1 John 3:4. And I agree, Dr. Shepard. I think that this is a subset proposition. I don't think that it's a convertible proposition in that sin and lawlessness are a one for one. I don't think that at all. I think that even you're right, that maybe even lawlessness or sin is the class, and lawlessness kind of falls into that category of an aspect of sin. But I say all that to say this, and then I got to go. If, and I think that just logically follows, but if there is a legal aspect to sin, then I think it would follow that there must, and y'all can hash this out if you want to. I'll go back and listen here in a little bit, but there must be a legal aspect to the remedy for that sin. And I say that, and I leave it on the table there. Y'all can hash that out. I love you guys. I've got to run. But I will check the 1 hour and 53 minute and 30-second timestamp for the answer. But guys, I love you, Dr. Shepard. Thank you so much for coming back on. Spencer, it was awesome. We got to have you back on CSG and Faith on Altar, brother.
I would love to.
You brought so much to the table. Sherman, God,
I appreciate it,
you, man. Absolutely. Sherman, man, like, I love you so much, dude. And just with the conversations that we've had, that you're diving into this has inspired me to dive into this. And bro, you're just such an inspiration. And Davidson, Jimmy, there's no words, bro. Like, you're my best friend. And so, guys, with that, I'm out of here. I'm going to go spend time with my lovely wife and my beautiful daughter that you just seen a few moments ago. And I will holler at you next time. But I will say this: stay like Christ, ladies and gentlemen. Stay like Christ. See ya.
Blessings, brother. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
All right.
So
see you guys.
I think if I were going to dive into an answer to that, looking at Colossians 2, 2:13, 14, 15, right? When you were dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us, and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. So if we want to talk about a legal aspect to it, having canceled the charge of our debt, having forgiven our debt, that would be a legal solution. Does that involve payment? That's the question we're arguing over, right? So I think that is one piece of it. Did we lose Dr. Shepard?
No. Oh, there he goes. Okay.
I got lost for some reason.
Oh no.
I think that was my fault. I accidentally
So at least on my screen, Spencer's on the other side now.
Yeah, you guys swapped.
Me too.
For PSA.
Yeah.
There you go.
There we go. You guys switch sides. The other thing I would say is that I don't think any of us would be arguing for something that would be forensic only, right? Whether we're talking about something forensic that then enables something further, or when we're what exactly the nature of that forensic thing is, those are different questions. But when we look at like how Chrysostom particularly looks at this, he speaks of dead works as having a foul odor, and that sin is no different from the plague, right? And plague doesn't need a legal solution. It needs something more than that. It needs healing. And so I would look at Colossians 2, 13, 14, 15, and say, I think we do have a legal solution. We were forgiven, and that certificate of debt is canceled. Whether or not there's payment is the argument. And then we also have more than just a legal solution, because we have Christ not just cleansing and purifying us from the taint of sin, but also cleansing our conscience, also then helping us to be reformed kind of into the new creation that can live and be standoffish towards sin, and can walk in the freedom of the Spirit. So yeah.
Well, for me, again, going back to Leviticus, looking at the language that is used there for that, like essentially for forgiveness, it's that idea of like nasa avon. So like the basic idea there is, when there is a transgression, a lawless act that has occurred, either the transgressor is going to bear their iniquity, is going to nasa their avon, or somebody or something else will bear it on their behalf. And so when I look at that, like there is definitely a forensic element to that, without a doubt, but it's all about how that forensic element plays out in practice. And again, going back to which figures are said to be the sin bearers, well, they're alive. It's the goat for Azazel and the priest. And so it's like the way that sins are forgiven is through that live sin bearer role, or at least insofar as it depends on God's action in in forgiving the sin. It's the one that actually bears the sin alive, that makes that happen.
So tying this also to the New Testament and the way that he was just asking that question in a more New Testament context, can we say even in the New Testament that sin is something that has more to do with the image of God than it does with the law necessarily, and that sin itself is perhaps something more like deviation from God's divine intent than it is anything like particularly a legal infraction, right? Like it doesn't have to be the violation of a law or any set of laws. It could in general just be deviation from God's intent, right? Like when God
I think that's the purpose of the law, right? Well, is to try to keep us in line with God's intent, right? So,
right, in a more explicit kind of generalized sense. But then there are times when God gives somebody an individual directive, right? In which case, if they failed to do that thing, even if it wasn't part of a command that was given generally to Israel or anyone else, right? If it was given particularly to them, like let's say Ezekiel, right? Or Jonah. Jonah's a great example. Jonah was told to go to Nineveh, right? Not everybody was sent to Nineveh, so it's not a law. But his failure to go to Nineveh was sin because it violated God's divine intent, right? Like God's directive is actually something that comes back to our representation of him as his image bearers, right? So that relationship. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, what you're talking about is Romans 3:23.
Yeah.
all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That image, that's image bearing language.
Yeah. And that's
Okay.
why when Tyler was asking about whether they're a one-to-one or what the relationship is between sin and lawlessness, for me, I think sin is, I don't even know if I want to say the bigger category, but I think lawlessness describes one aspect of what sin is. And sin also is falling short of the glory of God. And the law is in place as a tutor to help us to not fall short of the glory of God. Like, they're all interrelated, right? But this is why I tend to bristle when people just say sin is lawlessness and that utterly defines sin, because I think there's actually more to it than that. But I definitely see a relationship there for sure. And that idea of the law being put in place because of transgressions, because it's like, okay, you guys aren't doing this right. You need some extra help. You're not bearing the image of God well. And we've had multiple instances of this kind of going downhill between Adam and Eve, between Cain and Abel, between with Babel, and many different things, right? All of that kind of just combines into this large thing that is sin, keeping us from then being who we were meant to be.
So then Josh and Spencer, specifically for you guys, because I think I know how Dr. Shepard would answer this question specifically. Tyler asked about the forensic or legal part of atonement or the remedy for sin. Is there specifically something that is confined to a legal framework that is relevant to atonement that we see in the New Testament that's reflected in the Old Testament in the way that he asked? This like forensic declaration of innocence or the alleviation of legal guilt before God as judge. Where does that fall into line here? Because I know that's the largest or the biggest emphasis in the legal framework for a penal substitution is in fact that forensic declaration is kind of like you're justified, you're declared righteous, though you yourself are, let's say, not righteous in an exacted way, right? You're declared righteous, and then the Protestant idea is that as you're declared righteous in your, let's say, conversion moment or that process or whatever, and then you have sanctification that happens afterward, in which that declaration of your righteousness becomes true about you in some sense, right? What in your guys' view is the legal framework doing in atonement?
So I was actually going to save this for my kind of like thing at the end, but I might be running a little bit short on time anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into Colossians 2 there.
Well, that's okay. We're actually at the 2-hour mark, so it'd be a good idea to start rounding things off somewhere.
Okay. So that and you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together. So right there we have medical ontological language that is primary there, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. And then it says again with the Christus Victor, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. I mean, it's all kind of interwoven together. It's not like one or the other. It's all mixed in there. But the way that I'm seeing that, and going back to the Old Testament, as you talked about, Dr. Shepard, you had to start with the redemption, the Exodus came first. And it was the redeemed and purchased people. And that's the way that God talks about his people very often, is like, I bought you out of Egypt. I purchased you. And so like there's that kind of payment of cost, so to speak, that is done not because they were sinful and they had to have a payment in order to be forgiven, but because they were in slavery and they had to be redeemed. They had to be brought out of bondage. And so that certificate of debt is very much slavery payment, language there. So go ahead.
So are you talking specifically not about legal forgiveness before a judge as criminal, but you're talking about legal ownership of God's rightful property?
Which is, I mean, frankly, exactly what I think is going on in the hand press and gesture anyway. Some kind of like transfer of, yes, identification, but also ownership, in that like dedicating a thing for sacred space, dedicating it for sacred purpose, dedicating it to God, which we kind of see that as well in Leviticus 27 with the blasphemer who also gets hand placed on him, which he's already the sinner. Like, why would there be a sin transfer there when he's already the sinner? Like, it's actually going the other way around. So anyway, that's kind of a side rabbit trail. But the point here is that just like with the people of Israel, we see that in the narrative of Colossians 2, that, or actually they wouldn't be people of Israel at that time, with the Hebrews, let's put it that way. That they were in slavery, and there was a, so to speak, a certificate of debt. Because debt is very much a slavery motif in the New Testament. There was a certificate of debt that was held by, and now we're going to Romans 6, 23, by the slave master of sin. That, the wages of sin, the one who is paying for services rendered is sin, and the wages of sin is death. And actually, N.T. Wright in his translation actually says the wages paid by sin, which I think is probably the correct kind of conceptual idea there. And so in Colossians 2, when it says that certificate of debt was nailed to the cross, what's happening there is that redemption language, that buying back from slavery and taking that certificate of debt that was held by the cruel slave master of sin and nailing it. And now that transfer of ownership has happened. And like you were saying earlier at the very beginning, Dr. Shepherd, like now you're under a new master who does a whole different economy. Like God doesn't even deal in wages. Like that's clear in Romans 4. And so what we have instead is a new slave master who doesn't do that. He forgives, cancels that debt. And so we have that record that is standing against us because it's being held in the hands of the slave master of sin, who is taking the good law of God. This is Romans 7 with Paul, taking the good law of God and bringing it in to create death instead of bringing it to make life, which was its purpose and its intent. And so all of that is weaving together to create this forensic picture of you were under one ownership as a slave, bringing death. Misusing the law. And now you have been bought from that slave owner, brought into a whole different kingdom. And that's Colossians 1. He has transferred you from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light, brought into a whole new kingdom. And now the one who owns your certificate of debt is God. And he does something totally different. He brings life. And the way he does that is by taking that certificate that was owned by sin and now is owned by him, nails it to the cross and says, I'm done. I'm canceling that. I don't want that. And that's how he makes us alive.
So you view that primarily as then that transfer of ownership legally, and the payment is then not made to God, but made. Who's the payment made to? Make that more explicit.
I'm going to be really clear and really careful here because there is a distinction between a payment being made because it's required in like a transactional necessity sense. Right. And there's a difference between the payment being made because that is the agreed upon price. And I would say it's the second of the two.
So the agreed upon
price, the meaning of
for our freedom,
ransom,
right? So the agreed upon price for our freedom, let's say as the transfer of hands for a slave trade, right? It's kind of what you're talking about, is this like buying a servant on a market perhaps, or freeing an indentured servant from his indentured servitude by paying off whatever remaining debt that person had toward their debtor.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, I want to be really clear that, just like Dr. Shepherd was talking about, Dr. Shepherd was talking about with the conflation idea. This is not a one-to-one. Like we're working in the world of symbols here. So this is not a strict side-by-side literal.
Yeah.
Okay, Satan, here's the certificate. Here's the payment. Like that is definitely not what's happening here. But there is, I see it like I kind of alluded to a second ago. One of the meanings of atonement, kapar, is ransom. And we see that in Exodus 30. We see that in couple of other, there's at least one other place in Numbers I'm drawing a blank on. But the whole point there is that there's a transfer of ownership. So, and that's what makes us alive. And like Paul says in Romans 5, takes us from when we were enemies of God, now we're something else. Now we are, as he says in Romans 8, sons and daughters, adopted and made qualified to serve as to be able to receive the inheritance.
Well, and part of what makes that interesting is that you also have the conflation that's involved when you're talking about God ransoming the people out of Egypt by his mighty right hand. Then you have this idea of ransom almost attached to not making payment, but to victory. And you look at that and you go, man, there's a pool of all these things that are kind of thrown in here. And it can be really hard to just pull them out and try to make an equation with them that fits everything, that explains everything. And I think that's part of the frustration that we have, especially as kind of Western people that are used to being able to explain things, is it's just kind of beyond any of these things. And that's part of why I keep trying to point beyond any kind of linear idea around this one particular Old Testament sacrifice describes exactly how Christ's sacrifice worked, because there is a pool of all these things and it isn't linear and it's complicated. And so, I mean, I guess, do we want to start kind of moving to closing thoughts? Was that your closing thoughts, Spencer?
I mean, that would suffice for my closing thoughts.
Okay. I was going to say, actually,
but it has nothing to do with Leviticus. So.
Yeah. I noticed, Dr. Shepard, you were nodding your head through quite a few things in there. And it seemed like there was a good deal of overlap and agreement with some of the concepts that he was talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there are some things that I would probably disagree with as well. Okay. But overall, I'm pretty happy. I guess if I wanted to make any amendment to anything that Spencer said, it would be that, first of all, I appreciate the clarification that it's not a one-to-one thing, and I think it's kind of messy in a way. But on the one hand, Satan has power over us because we have broken God's law, and he has this accusatory function, and somehow or other, he has that accusatory function as something that God has granted to him. He's given it to him, and yet at the same time, it's still the truth that it was God's law that we broke, and we owe something to him as well. And so I see God as being the one who, in Christ, provides his own self-satisfaction through Christ's sacrifice. So that's the only thing I would say there in response. But no, I liked a lot of stuff that was going on here. It's just admitting that as we go from old to new, that it's not just a one-to-one correspondence is huge right there.
Yeah, I think if I were going to try to kind of give closing thoughts myself, one of the things that we didn't touch on yet, that it would be really interesting to get into is this. One of the ideas that Dr. Shepard had in his commentary is that all of the sacrifices were propitiatory in some way, and one of the things that I'd like to tug on a little bit, and maybe this does mean another episode, I don't know.
Yes,
is looking at that and saying, I can see that more than I kind of originally did when I was like, I don't know if I like that idea, because I do think there is a connection between the idea of God being pleased and the pleasing aroma that the sacrifices have. The part that I struggle with is then in kind of instantaneously saying, and we know that propitiation means that God's wrath is appeased. Because propitiation can have a range of meanings. It's about the person or deity being pleased, but where did they start when you then got to them being pleased is the question, right? So if God was wrathful and you propitiate him, then theoretically he's no longer wrathful. If God was already, thinking about Noah when Noah then made a sacrifice and the pleasing aroma reaches God, that doesn't seem to me to be so much about God saying, well, now I'm no longer wrathful towards Noah. I'm pleased, I'm propitiated. But it seems like it becomes more of a sense of God being pleased that Noah took a step towards him in the proper way, because he offered this thing that is what you are supposed to offer when you are looking to interact with someone of the status of God, right? So, and then God responds by one saying, I'm going to actually treat you a bit like a priest, because I'm no longer then going to be having creation under wrath, and I'm not going to flood the earth again and all of that. So there's a sense in which what Noah did wasn't necessarily appeasing God's wrath for his own sake, but it was definitely changing the relationship that God had between creation and himself after the flood. And then you also have this idea of God then saying, okay, because you have entered into this properly, I'm now going to enter into covenant with you. And so that's something I would love to tug on a little bit more. I think the main thing I would frame as maybe an alternative view to understanding the sacrifices would be something like sacrifices are friend-making gifts of hospitality, primarily of food, that are also pledges that people give to God of the wholeness of what they are offering, as a way of saying, this is the level of commitment that I have to you, to God, that I'm turning away from the sin. If it was a sin offering, that I'm coming to you and not to another God, that I'm, whatever the various, kind of offering is for whatever the purpose is, it's about that friend-making gift exchange that God invites people into in a reciprocal manner, and people living into that and saying, here is my pledge of my commitment to you. And then the difference that we see in the Old Testament sacrifices and then the New is that those pledges in the Old Testament could only go so far, because they couldn't actually make the people then able to fulfill the pledge. Right. Whereas Christ, in incorporating us into himself, in enabling us to be indwelled with the Holy Spirit, and the cleansing of conscience that he provides, enables people to actually live that out in a way that wasn't necessarily possible in the same way with the Old Testament sacrifices. And what we see is Christ referred to as the first fruits among the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. And I had always looked at that as just like, yeah, he's like the first one that was resurrected, right? But I had this moment where I realized, like, what do you do with first fruits in the Old Testament? You offer them to God. Right. And so to me, I think that there's also this sense of Christ being the one who is the perfect offering. That's the pledge of humanity, saying this is the level of commitment that we have to this relationship with God. And because he's actually the one who can do it perfectly, there's more to it than just the pledge, because he enables us to actually do that. So that kind of friend-making gift, that kind of pledge of loyalty and obedience, and then the ability to actually do that because of Christ's sacrifice, I feel like that's a really compelling way to look at the Old Testament sacrifices that carries into the New, that has a real solid, consistent biblical theology to it. So that's what I would put that out there for people to consider as they're looking at the Old Testament sacrifices and thinking about how these work.
Yeah, to be honest, that's a really closing statements indeed, Sherman. Go ahead, Spencer.
Oh, I was just going to riff off of that a little bit and say that I did a little bit of looking into the number of times that the term, pleasing aroma comes up in the Levitical texts and the rest of the Torah. Well, and, on into the prophets too. And I mean, I actually, set it up in a graph, or not a graph, but a table. And it's just like paired with food offering language, paired with food offering language, paired with food offering language. Like just that whole idea of a concept of a pleasing aroma is directly connected to communion with the divine. And
so my intuition is that the direct reference to the Eucharist,
yes,
that comes later.
Yes.
And if you want to tie it in with that, then you have that idea of, Christ then enabling us to then give of ourselves in the same way that he gave of himself. And that all tied in with the Eucharist, and that all tied in with the body of Christ acting in the world in ways that can be redemptive because we're bringing the redemption that Christ accomplished to the world in that self-offering, not just in preaching the gospel, but like in like love that hurts, like, yeah, it's very, there's so much there that's just like this participation, and that to me is what I feel like is missing if you have a view that is only about penal substitutionary atonement and you're not looking at these other things. You're going to miss that participatory aspect really big time. We can argue over the whole thing about whether PSA or not, but that definitely is true.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it sounds like our next episode, and I insist, but it sounds like our next episode is going to be about atonement and sacrament. That's how these things seem to be tying together right now. And I think that would probably be the next place to go with this.
That's beautiful.
The way that, because this is in my mind right now, I'm mulling over the symbolism of eating that starts all the way back in the garden, and how that all ties into this entire conversation all the way through, and then becomes the fulfillment of this conversation, not only in the cross, but in our ongoing participation through receiving the sacrament, not only of baptism, but particularly of eating the body and the blood, right? And how the blood is illegal to eat, and yet Christ offers us his blood. And so I think that is a great place to end here. This has been so fantastic. And I really think if we do this again, and I really want to, that would be the way to tie these things even further into the Old Testament and the New Testament. Maybe we can make some focus of Hebrews as well.
Well, and it would work great with Leviticus still, because in Leviticus 10, that's how the priest bears sin or bear iniquity, is through that eating process. So yes, absolutely.
Well, and I know we also had that another tie into the kind of the intercarnational aspect of this that Dr. Shepard wanted to bring as a closer. So I think maybe we hand it off to Dr. Shepard for his closing.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted, okay. So I just wanted to make a couple of interesting. Those of you who have my commentary can find this, and this is a long thing, but I'm going to shorten it tremendously for the sake of our viewers. But a very interesting Leviticus connection here, I think, is
where is this in your commentary, by the way?
Pardon?
Where what chapter in your commentary?
Oh, if you have it in front of you, it would be on pages 166 to 169. First of all,
okay.
But again, I'm going to shorten this great deal.
Okay.
But after Jesus is born, you have that whole thing where Mary and Joseph go through the purification ceremony. And again, I'm going to make this very short, but one of the interesting things then is that when Jesus, in connection with the purification ceremony, when Jesus himself is circumcised, he now becomes a child of the covenant. And this is one of the things that I think Paul may have in mind when he talks about Jesus coming under the law. And so as soon as he is born, there is the circumcision, and he becomes a child of the covenant. Gerhardus Voss, in one of his publications, makes this statement. He says, "It is rightly observed that the blood of the Savior's circumcision is as much atoning blood for us as is the blood shed on Golgotha."
Whew.
So very interesting connection there. And what makes it really interesting is that Jesus becomes a child of the covenant by being circumcised at one end of Luke's gospel. At the other end of Luke's gospel, he initiates the new covenant, and he initiates it in his blood and says, this is for the forgiveness of sins. So one thing that I would really want to emphasize in this regard is that, again, just noting that atonement is a multi-faceted, tiered, layered thing. And so when did Jesus atone for our sins? When he was incarnated. His
Amen.
entire life was an atonement for sins.
That is fantastic.
And even now, as he's incarnate as our great high priest. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Our holy man in heaven. Yeah. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out. And the other thing that I wanted to make reference to is also in Luke's gospel, the high priest Zechariah. It's very interesting to me that he is the first person to whom any kind of revelation about the Messiah is made. Mm-hmm. And he's a priest. Did I say high priest? If I did, I didn't mean to.
You did, but yeah.
I think I did, but he's a priest. And so, interestingly, the first announcement about the Messiah in the New Testament is made to Zechariah as a priest. Mm. After he while he is in there getting this revelation, he questions it. And because of that, he is now made mute. He is now a priest with a defect. Mm. He cannot be priest anymore, at least for a while, until his voice is restored.
I hadn't thought about that.
And when his voice is restored, he sings out in that song called the Benedictus. We've given it a label. And here is this priest from Levi who calls attention to this new priest who's just been born, who will not be from Levi, but is from Judah. And then, of course, later on, we learn from Melchizedek. Mm-hmm. And he is the one, it's not in Mary's song, but it's in Zechariah's song that talks about how this figure, the Lord, will be the one who will forgive us for our sins. So the priesthood is now shifted to Jesus, who becomes the sacrifice for our sins. So a couple of Advent connections for us here in regards to this whole discussion.
I love that.
I feel like Mary's is he will save his people from
their sins.
And then his is he will forgive. Yeah. Wow, that's neat.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, I have to say that you've given me a good chunk of things to think about from the book of Luke, which I will be frequenting for the next week.
Good deal.
Thank you for that. This has been fantastic. I'm going to echo Tyler in saying this is awesome. And you guys are blowing my mind for real. I'm super pleased with how this entire episode flowed, and my prayer has been answered, that God guided our minds and tongues as we spoke about these things. He is so good, and this was fantastic. I cannot wait to extend this conversation into incarnation, sacrament, and now we're talking about, like you said, this. I think that's really the way to look at it, is incarnation and sacrament, and like you said, participation, Sherman, like this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Those three, I think those three things are going to be the focal point of the next conversation about this.
Which, if you show them to me in that meme with Pam from The Office, I'm going to say they're the same picture.
Right? Yeah, for real. And then and maybe we'll make some application for how these things can play out in our participation ongoing in the body as well. Exactly. And so I again, thank you so much, Sherman, for all your input, and Spencer, welcome to CSG, bro. Thank you so much for your participation here, Dr. Shepard. I really appreciate your countenance is like infectious. Like I like your very calm and gracious and patient with our discussions here, and you give a lot of space for the conversation to happen, and I just appreciate that so much. This has been really great, and I'm very thankful right now. I'm just very thankful. And to everybody who's watching, please make sure to like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. If you have a second, please pray for all of us. that these things would not bring about Satan's attack because we started speaking up, but that God would just continue to bless this entire exchange, and that this can be something that's very fruitful for anybody who's listening. And I just am so excited that we've had continuous listeners to this entire broadcast, and this has been really cool. And Merry Christmas, because this is bringing a whole new level for my excitement to just this whole thing. It seems to have just this expansive nature about it, to see how all of these things in Leviticus are actually so integral to all of the things that are part of our just fundamentals. Like this is why I said you guys are blowing my mind, is that I'm starting to notice pieces that I had, pieces I didn't have, and how they're appropriated together for a much bigger, more holistic picture of what Christianity is. And for that, I am extremely thankful. But I, with that being said, we're at about the 2.5 hour mark. I think this is probably a good time to cut it off and say that we'll see everybody again. And I hope that everybody here is okay with doing more of this, because I really, like I said before, this is a topic worth revisiting for sure. Thank you for your work, Dr. Shepard, on a commentary that has been
thank you very much
fantastic thing for us to work on as a premise, and this has been such a blessing to me. Thank you for being.
If I can slip in one more Christmas connection.
Yeah, go ahead.
Christ came and he tabernacled among us.
Yes.
I was just reading John 1 yesterday with my buddies, and
like,
dude,
Leviticus, the presence of God, Christmas, like it's all
Yeah, I've been frequenting John chapter 1 with a couple of different friends that came over in the last week or so with Bible studies independently of one another, and so that's been.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:1.
There you go. That's my wife making proclamation of how exciting this has been, actually, to just
amen.
It's rattling through the house for sure.
Favorite author for sure.
But I just thank you again to everybody listening. I pray that everybody is having a fantastic Advent time, and that this really is such a special thing that's going on. But in honor of Tyler, who had to leave and go be with his family, I'll say good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.